Welcome. First, I'd like to begin by acknowledging we are meeting on Gadigal country of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'll also acknowledge all Aboriginal people in the room today. Look, when I reflect on the importance of acknowledging country, especially in this place, I also reflect on the history of the Parliament and really its role as the legislature, where laws have been made, laws that have impacted every aspect of an Aboriginal person's life. And some of those laws were from where they could live, where they could travel, who they could marry, language that could be spoken, to name a few, removal of children even. And it really highlights to me the ongoing importance of truth-telling and really our shared history. I also acknowledge everyone joining us online today too. In the room joining us today is Julie Langsworth, who is my big boss. I also would like to acknowledge David Blunt, the Clerk of the Parliament, and also Carly Maxwell, who is the Deputy Clerk of the Legislative Assembly and is representing Helen Minnikin, the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly. And joining us online, who is, apology for in-person today, is Mark Webb, the CEO of Department of Parliamentary Services. I'm Stephen Collins. I'm a Pitta man, and for those of you that are aware, I'm also the Aboriginal Liaison Officer here at Parliament and your moderator this morning. And thank you for joining us for National Reconciliation Week with our public sector leaders in conversation. I know all of us are here to enjoy a good yarn, and I've got the hardest job of all, keeping us all on track. So, and also, I know with some of our panel members, they're used to being on the other side of the table, not this side of the table, especially for budget estimates. Look, today marks the first day of National Reconciliation Week, and acknowledge yesterday was National Sorry Day. And today and this week is really about a time for all of us to explore and learn about our shared histories, cultures and achievements, and explore how we can all contribute to achieving reconciliation. The theme for Reconciliation Week is more than a word. Reconciliation takes action, and it urges us, I guess, to take more impactful action, and reminds me of the importance of ensuring Aboriginal voices are heard. Today also marks the anniversary of the 1967 referendum, in which more than 90% of Australian voters chose yes to count Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the census and give the Australian government the power to make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Previously, this was done by the state, and it was laws varied as well. Look, when I also reflect on this year's theme and the importance of it, and as I said, as part of my acknowledgement, I reflect here on my role at Parliament and looking for ways that we can break down barriers and promote our shared history. Launched today, for those that can have a look, in the Fountain Court, we have a new exhibition called This Is Where They Travelled, and it really invites us to connect to the lives and stories of Aboriginal people who lived in and around the Sydney coast between the 1800s and up until the 1930s. This is on display until the end of July, and it follows the journeys of 10 Aboriginal men and women, including how their lives changed as Sydney as a city grew, and perhaps how much they remained the same. I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel members this morning, and thank you for being here today. We have Lil Gordon, Head of Aboriginal Affairs, Peter White, Senior Manager Aboriginal Strategy and Engagement, Create New South Wales, Kathrina Lowe, our New South Wales Public Sector Service Commissioner, and also Joann Wilkie, Deputy Secretary for Economic Strategy and Productivity. We'll be hearing from our sector leaders today about what this year's reconciliation theme means for Aboriginal employment in the public sector, and with discussion around attraction, retention, career development, representation and productivity. I'd also like to quickly acknowledge that the Honourable Jonathan O'Dea MP, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, is joining us here this morning too. I will join you at the table just in a moment, but if you would like to introduce yourselves, tell us a bit about your role, and what does this year's reconciliation theme mean to you? And we'll start with you, Lil.
Oh. I feel like I should be asking everyone out there questions. Hi, Lil Gordon, Niambar woman, a little town out west called Brewarrina. I too would like to acknowledge country and pay respects to elders past and present from the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I certainly want to pay respects to our stolen generations and acknowledge their absolute resilience, their strength, their courage, their bravery in every way, but their generosity in sharing the stories that they do towards healing for all of us really across the country. And I was privileged to go to an event last night at the Opera House, and that was really them showcasing their talents, and there's lots of them there, lots of singing and some dancing and a lot of healing that was done in that space. So it was a privilege to be able to be there for them. For me, you know, in terms of the theme, reconciliation takes action, and in terms of it's more than a word. I mean, reconciliation sounds really lovely and really fluffy. In practice, it's a little bit harder in terms of what that actually means. So from my perspective, I take it from a position of being brave and really stepping into a space for non-Aboriginal people and Aboriginal people that probably is a little bit uncomfortable at times. It's definitely based around truth-telling, but the recognition of what that truth is. We can continue to tell the truth, but if that's not heard and recognised and accepted, that's not true reconciliation from my perspective. And so a lot of the times when I'm talking to my friends or people that I know about what they can do practically, it is about being able to step into the space, being brave to call out things when they're not appropriate, whether that's racism or the way people are being treated, be able to go themselves and find out some of the history in terms of their own responsibility in doing that is absolutely part of Reconciliation Week and Reconciliation Year every day, really, in terms of that. And I think the other part of that is the at times just sitting and listening, not necessarily, you know, wanting to respond to things. And it's that concept of walk with me and building those really positive, trusting relationships. That's probably a start, so I don't want to keep on going and taking too much of the time, even though I'm in the middle.
Thanks.
Peter.
Yeah, thanks. So, Peter White, Gomeroi Murray from northwest New South Wales, born and bred in Tamworth, but mob's from a little town called Manila, Bora Crossing. Just also like to acknowledge country here and Gadigal people. I have the privilege and honour and obligation, I guess, of living and working on Gadigal country, and you know what that means to me as well is essential to this theme of the understanding of what it is to live and work on other people's country and what that brings, and understanding where they're coming from, not only their history, but you know the impacts that have happened. You know, this is ground central. We all talk about it. You know, New South Wales, particularly also the Gadigal people, are the first peoples of first contact that continued and continues to this day. We have the longest impacts of cultural disruption, but also the longest resilience. And as Lil said, you know, just to acknowledge and remember our stolen generations and the impacts and the strength that they have had to endure, and they're showing the way to us. You know, that's part of those impacts. I think, you know, in looking at this year's theme, I'm actually quite excited. It's great to hear more than a word, you know, reconciliation takes action, because I think that's what, you know, it's one of those things that, you know, I think we have the tools now. Certainly reconciliation action plans are a good tool to actually, you know, help us navigate to the spaces where we need to be. Do we actually enact them? And I think that's the key challenge. And I think in this time, you know, the great opportunity is there is a greater awareness and there is a greater understanding and a time to act right here and now. But I think with that understanding and from a First Nations perspective, you know, that understanding is always needing to be built on. And I think, you know, I just, you know, take a bit of time to think about what Stephen was saying in being in this place and the laws that were made and passed. And the recognition that in those histories, I'm sure that there was a lot of goodwill and good intent of trying to help and do things. But I think where the impact is the limited understanding of a very complex and dynamic societies and structures, and that lack of understanding actually had a detrimental effect, and we were able to reflect on that yesterday. So I think this is a point in time, and it's the challenge that we continually need to be asked of what are we personally going to take action to.
Fantastic. Joann?
Thanks, Stephen. So I'm Joann Wilkie from New South Wales Treasury, as Stephen already mentioned. So, and I'm very honoured to have been asked onto the panel. Reconciliation and I guess diversity more broadly is something that's very important to me, and it's something that I champion within New South Wales Treasury. So thank you very much. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And while I'm not Aboriginal, I would also like to acknowledge the custodians of the land where I grew up, which was Bundjalung in Northern Rivers, New South Wales. They say home is where the heart is, and there's always that connection that you feel when you visit the place you grew up. The more I read about Aboriginal culture, the connection to country is something that I guess I can recognise what that feels whenever I visit home. And so the people of Bundjalung and the country of Bundjalung is something that I'm taking a lot of time to learn more about, and some of those truths in there. And I guess that's the sort of thing, that's what reconciliation means to me. It is more than just a word. It is about finding out more about the things that happen. So, for example, in Bundjalung, one of the stories that's been passed down and has actually made it into some of the histories of the area written by white people, which is surprising because a lot of the time the history of the Aboriginal people, or the very fact that there were Aboriginal people living in an area, is often ignored in white history. But some of the stories include things like the local settlers doing things like putting poison into flour and then providing the flour as supplies to the local Aboriginal community, and of course dozens and dozens of people dying as a result of those sorts of actions. So some of that is incredibly shocking to read and to understand, but the two things that Reconciliation Australia is really focusing on as part of this year's theme are the need for truth-telling as part of the pathway for reconciliation, and to be brave. So to acknowledge that I had ancestors who were living in that area at the time that event occurred, and that if they were not part of it, they were certainly complicit in accepting that was something that was happening in that area at that time. So that sort of thing is always very confronting to think about, and both that and also the trauma that then has for the Aboriginal Bundjalung people who still live in that area. So for me, that truth-telling, that bravery, as Lil in particular emphasised, is really important in reconciliation. And I think the other thing about this year's theme, and the Reconciliation Australia sort of points out, is the pathway that this is a journey where you need to be truthful about your personal biases, you need to be truthful about our nation's past, and you need to be truthful about the systemic racism that continues to exist today in the very institutions of government that I have made a career working in. And so then you need to be brave enough to take that personal journey to confront those truths about yourself and about the country and the history that we all love. But you also have to be then brave enough to have those conversations with colleagues, with family, and at some points to even call that out. And if we don't have that, if we can't reconcile ourselves to those truths, and if we can't bring ourselves to be brave, then we will accept inertia and we will walk past that standard, and that is essentially the standard we will accept, which I don't think is good enough for Australia or for New South Wales or for me and my children. for me, it's about reconciliation is about that personal journey, but it's also then about taking where I work on that journey and my family on that journey as well. And I think one of the things, I'm an economist, so numbers always strike me. So there were statistics in the reconciliation stocktake report that really struck me, that over 70% of Australians in the general community and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people believe in the possibility of unity, and that around 90% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Australians in the general community also support formal truth-telling processes in relation to Australia's shared history. That tells me we've got a pretty good basis for stepping forward, and those are the sorts of numbers that we also saw in the same-sex postal referendum. So if we did a referendum on this, it would tell me that the resounding answer would be yes to truth-telling and yes to unity, and I think that's a pretty good place for us to start and to take that next step.
Perfect. Thank you. Kathrina.
Hi everyone, I'm not sure if my mic's working, hopefully it is. First of all, Stephen, thank you for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation, and I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today. And I did want to note that my family has been in this country for 60 years, and I compare that with the time Aboriginal people have been on this land. So my parents weren't born in Australia, I wasn't born in Australia, I came here when I was very young, and I'm so grateful that, you know, my family is able to make this country home. But I do want to note that this was originally the home of Aboriginal people, and I'm so grateful to be able to call this country home. In reflecting on today, I was thinking I've been Public Service Commissioner for just over a year now, and I'm responsible for workforce strategy and reform and key workforce programs for the sector as a whole. And one of the legacies that I do want to leave when I finish my term as Public Service Commissioner is to have a public sector workforce that reflects the diversity of the community that we serve, including at the senior leadership level of the service. And I think we've got a bit of a way to go there, particularly when it comes to the secretary, deputy secretary and agency head levels. So that's something I will definitely be working with the sector on. In terms of what the theme of this year's Reconciliation Week means to me, it's really a call to action. It's a challenge, I think. It challenges me to think about what can I do personally to take action, what are the practical things that I can do. And I think being a senior leader in the sector and being Public Service Commissioner means that I have influence that comes with that role, and it's about, well, how am I going to use that influence to create better outcomes for people? And when I'm thinking of the sector as a whole, because my role has a responsibility for workforce across the sector, what it means to me is building the cultural capability of our sector so that it's reflected in everything we do. It's reflected in how we communicate, it's reflected in how we deliver our work, it's reflected in how we engage with the community, and it's reflected in the sorts of workplaces that we're creating and shaping. You know, are our workplaces inclusive and safe, not only for Aboriginal people, but for all our staff? And I think that there are really practical things that we can do, and the PSC, you know, I'll talk about some of the things that we're doing, but later this year we'll be releasing a video which Stephen has actually had a key role on. It's a training package called Everybody's Business, Everyone's Business, and it's really aimed at lifting the cultural capability and having a trauma-informed workforce, and we're really grateful to be doing that work in partnership with Stolen Generations organisations, where they're informing design and content of the training package. Other things that we're doing is we lead the Premier's priority on a world-class public service, and that includes a target of having 114 Aboriginal senior leaders by 2025. We're at 105 at the moment, so we're on a good trajectory to get there, but we mustn't take our foot off the pedal. I'm really pleased that this year in our graduate intake for the sector, 9% of our graduates are really talented Aboriginal people, so I think we need to keep up those sorts of numbers. And finally, I just want to say it really is important to recognise significant Aboriginal events and to celebrate them. And yesterday, the PSC published a calendar of significant Aboriginal events, and I'd encourage you to go onto our website and take a look. There's just a brief explanation of each of those significant events and some really practical actions that we can take in our workplace to celebrate, commemorate, signify those events. So I'll stop there because I know there's lots of other questions on the way as well.
The calendar does look fantastic if you do go have a look at it. I did have a look. One of the themes that I'm picking up here very quickly is the importance of truth-telling. So hearing about that, and it obviously has a part to play when we talk reconciliation, I'm really keen to hear from you. What are the challenges in the sector with truth-telling and talking reconciliation? Start with you.
Challenges of truth-telling, I think we've heard a bit about it. I think there's courage out there. Courage is always a challenge in the right place, but also the structures and systems, but also the environments that we actually develop to actually take that courage and turn it into something proactive. So I think, safe spaces for having difficult conversations are needed. So more conversations, more bringing people together. At the basis of that, I think, is the ability to have empathy, and I think we talk a lot about that, but sometimes empathy falls down under competing priorities, particularly in government, of timing, resources, all of that. So, creating the spaces and creating that space to be able to have those tough dialogues sometimes, but also an openness. And I think that's one of the real values, and sometimes I feel it's undervalued, of Aboriginal people, the generosity that we have, the gifts. I think a lot of people at certain levels, when you actually talk with Aboriginal staff and that, and it's like, get down, deep down, it's like, we're really exhausted, and I'd say talking about, today being 67 and, what we're building on, those champions, those warriors that have come before us so many years before, but we still have that challenge. We're still turning up. I think what gets in the road is the uneasiness of, there is no easy toolkit that we can, we can't pick that manual off the wall and this is what it's going to be. And the honesty of actually going back and embracing our history. I think, there's an exhibition that's just opened up the road, Unsettled, at the Australian Museum, that brings to light a lot of these histories and stories. The unfortunate thing is it's just a very small bit of the history. There's so much more out there. And until we're willing to fully embrace that and fully embrace it to the need to actually understand, and, as I said, creating that understanding to act on for the greater good. And look, I always, when I'm asked to talk about leadership and, changing, the way society is, and particularly in the cultural space, I like to simplify it in that personal, take personal action and charge, and just that fundamental question to ask yourself, am I a good person? And I think that's to me, how to navigate that, to be more open. Don't be so scared, and I think that's on both sides. The understanding that from a lot of our communities and that there's a lot of trauma out there, hell of a lot of trauma. We need to have the time to unpack it ourselves and have our own spaces for that before we're able to fully share, to be a productive way forward, because I think what we're all about is that shared future that acceptance of who we all are individually, but the shared future that what we actually envisage for our communities, our state, our nation.
Great. Kathrina, would you like to share your thoughts?
Thank you. I think truth-telling is so important, and in preparation for today, I went back and read last night the Uluru Statement from the Heart, where, you know, truth is such a fundamental component of what's being asked for. But equally as important, I think, is truth listening, and I think Aboriginal people have been sharing the truth about the impact of colonisation for a long time now. So the question really is, for those of us who aren't Aboriginal, are we willing to do the truth listening? And sometimes that can be really confronting, and we can learn some things about Australian history which may shock us, which may appall us, which may really sadden us. But I think if we're willing to listen, we'll probably also hear stories of survival, of resilience, of immense dignity in really trying circumstances. And I've had the privilege of a cultural immersion experience on Darkinjung country hosted by the Barang Regional Alliance, which I know, Lil, you were involved in before. And as part of that experience, we had time set aside for fireside yarns. And I have to say that was the most impactful part of the cultural immersion experience for me, to hear firsthand people's stories. And I went away thinking afterwards, wow, we as government have really stuffed up some people's lives here, and yet here they still are, wanting to engage with us, wanting to work with us, and the amount of grace and dignity and generosity of spirit that takes is actually pretty amazing, really. So I think from my perspective, truth telling and truth listening actually go together, and we can't have reconciliation without both of those things.
Bill, please.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's very interesting. I guess, you know, the truth, I guess, is often quite inconvenient for people ultimately, and leveraging off both what Peter and Kathrina said in terms of the listening element. I think one of the challenges is that there's quite a bit of disbelief in the truth. Could we possibly believe that flour was poison? Could we possibly believe there were so many massacres? Could we possibly believe our kids were taken for the sake of the fact that it was based on their race? So I think, you know, part of the challenge is that it's almost unbelievable that it's hard for people to engage in the truth. So, you know, in terms of leveraging off that, it is the storytelling, it is the connection with people and really listening to certainly the things that have happened, but also there's that element of healing that Aboriginal people are trying to get to. It's not a case of just here's our story and here's all the terrible things that had happened, but there's that next step of being really wanting to heal and to be part of the country as a whole is really important in that aspect. And the other point that was made was certainly about, you know, prior to a lot of the horrible stuff that happened is also that great stuff, the great stuff of culture, the great stuff of connection to country, the things where we've looked after the country for people to enjoy. You know, I often talk when we think about the acknowledgement of country, which at times can get a bit tokenistic. So, you know, I ask people to think about a place that's really significant to you, a place you might have been going with the kids for generations, a tree in your backyard. It could be a place at the beach, you know, in the ocean. That's not my place because there's giant things that can eat your hole in there. I'm more muddy water all the time. You know, just have a think about when you're at that place, what can you hear? What can you see? What might you smell? What can you taste? But who do you remember? What's the connections you remember at that place? So that place holds those memories for you. That tree, that dirt, that sand, that rock, that's what country is. That's what connection to country is. And when we acknowledge her and we acknowledge country, we're acknowledging that place because of what it brings to everybody. So that's the strength of truth-telling as well. It's that connection and that deep connection to country. So imagine being connected to that place for 10 years. Imagine being connected to that place for 50 years. Generations have been going there for 200 years. Imagine being connected to that place for 60,000 years. That's real truth-telling, and that's really the essence of who we are as well. So it's not just those other things that make us resilient. That makes us resilient. So it's those positive elements too that we need to bring to the forefront as much as anything else. But it's really important that we do recognise the very, very poor history we have as a country in terms of the treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as well. But then what are the steps that come from that? And that's part of reconciliation.
You really want me to follow that? I think we should just leave this bit here. No, look, so I can't, I'm not going to try and add to what Peter, Lil and Kathrina have already said in the sort of the individual and the social, I guess. Let me take a slightly different tack, one that Treasury is trying to grapple with, which is the truth-telling for institutions. So Treasury takes pride in the fact that it is a Treasury, that we are at the centre of government, that we are one of the oldest government institutions in New South Wales. We are one of the oldest government institutions in New South Wales, which means some of the things you were talking about before, Stephen, in terms of the things that the laws that have come out of this place and the impacts that they have had on the Aboriginal people of New South Wales. Again, Treasury has been part of that. Our role is always to cost the impact of policies and to fund government and that sort of thing. So grappling with that truth, but one of the things is that so economists also believe, or some of us do anyway, in the idea of historical path dependence for economies and societies. So the idea then to look at is, and what have some of those historical truths and have some of those historical actions meant about the way we still do things in government today? And so one of the examples that gets used a lot in Treasury is a recognition of, if we don't have appropriate cultural understanding when we are assessing government policies, we may do things like say, this project is just going too slow. We're going to not allow that money to be carried forward, only to then, when you investigate it a little bit further, to better understand that that community is an Aboriginal community. They've had a number of funerals and there's been significant sorry business that's had to be undertaken, and therefore that project has been delayed for that reason. So under those circumstances, if you have some cultural understanding, it does seem somewhat churlish and indeed fairly unethical to say, let's not roll that money over. So some of those things for us about the way that we might make as officers in Treasury, whatever our ethnic background or our diversity background is, that we might make assumptions from our own experience about here's what is going on in this situation and therefore the policy prescription should be X. Actually, you need to take a step back, take more stock of the context and better think about what is going to be the impact on that community or that part of New South Wales, or that the well-being of that set of people of New South Wales if we make a decision or we make presumptions that don't appropriately take into context, including cultural context. So that truth-telling for us in terms of the impact that Treasury as an institution may have had in the past, but then extrapolating that forward and thinking about the impact we may still be having because of that historical institutional background.
Fantastic. Pete and Lil, touching on that and on a couple of things that I've heard here as well, are really around the local history and that is very important as well. What's some of those challenges then at that higher level when we're doing policy? Because I'm hearing that there, when you like that example you're using, do you want to add anything there that you say?
in the local.
Well, like when we think about local history and that, so there's that side of it, and then what's the challenge there when we're thinking about policy at a state level when we're many different mobs and nations?
I think for me it's the voices, and how we get those voices through into what we can consider the higher levels of government. So, that's nothing against anyone who, feels that's the case. So it is those local and regional voices and how we make sure they are embedded in any of that policy-making, decision-making. So, we have a couple of strategies that have certainly been around for a while, and shared decision-making is not necessarily a new term overall, but it's where one of the things that you talked about was sitting around and having sharing, listening to people and doing that. So that concept of being in the circle, the concept of everybody being heard is one of those around shared decision making. And so, we've had local decision making as an entity. You mentioned Barang is one of those. Look, we've had ATSIC in the past, my dad being the longest serving ATSIC commissioner. This has been tried and tried. We now have closed the gap where we have a shared decision making with the Coalition of Peaks in terms of that level. And when we talk about the closing the gap, which is seen as a deficit model in the past, and the language itself is seen as a deficit language, the concept in terms of the partnership approach is incredibly important, because you're hearing the voices at the table and at the very highest levels, as people might put it, whereas I probably see the local level and the regional level is the highest level, because that's where the truth is, that's where the people know the stories, that's where Aboriginal communities know exactly what's happening on the ground, despite maybe what data's flowing through at any one time. So there's 5 key priority areas that we're focused on around this time. Partnerships and shared decision making is absolutely one of those, so making sure that we're at the table in an equal way. It's not just at the table for the sake of saying, yeah, we had them at the table as part of that discussion, but there are decisions that are made that are shared in that approach. The other part of that is building the Aboriginal community controlled sector to be able to do the work of government a lot of the time. So when we talk about the spend on Aboriginal issues, for want of a better word, a lot of that's around administration and lots of people travelling into communities. If we're building the people who live there to be able to deal with those, then that's a better approach overall. The third one, which is interesting, and it does connect to certainly one of the 5 dimensions when they talk about from Reconciliation Australia, is around the transformation of government. And that's some of what you talk about, is that transformation, is thinking differently. Certainly the elimination of racism is a big call, and certainly one that will be tough in that realm. But how do we get government to think differently? You do that by sharing decisions and listening to people around the table as part of that. Data, very, very important. And as you mentioned, it's one of your key factors over there in Treasury. But, it's the access to shared data. And there's the data set itself, but then there's the living experience and story that goes with that in terms of Aboriginal communities. And the last one really is around employment, business growth and economic prosperity for Aboriginal people. So incredibly important when we're talking about those local and regional voices and being able to make a difference for Aboriginal people on the ground. So on the whole, most of our communities won't be backwards in telling you exactly what's required and exactly what's needed. It's how we listen to that and how we grow from that and how we grow together in that. So the more people go from public service, go on country and they connect with Aboriginal people, and whether it's sitting around the fire, going for a walk, doing those things, that's the essential part. It's that, and that's true reconciliation in terms of the connection that gets made and the building of those trusting relationships, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, look, I think one of the real challenge, the big challenge out there, and we hear a lot of talk around process, and I guess the widely accepted benefits of things like co-design. And that understanding, particularly in the health area and also Aboriginal affairs and that shared decision making. But I think it's to the point of the understanding. I go back to the understanding again. The understanding. It's just not about co-design. It's about co-delivery. It's about co-evaluation. It's moving it away. And you hear this time and time again. Moving away from a transactional approach to a relationship base, which is where it comes from us. That's 60,000 time immemorial. That's why we have the luxury of, in this country, saying this is the longest, oldest, continuous culture, because we worked out a pretty good system. And it's actually impacted not only environmental change, ice ages and that, but severe social disruption. We've come through it. We're still here. Do we actually really fully value, and I guess that's the other big factor, like New South Wales has an Aboriginal languages legislation. Out of all of that disruption and change, we still have language here. We're still, and we're moving past, what has happened in the past to reinvigorating, and that is that grounding of knowledge of country as well, because it's the language is how we speak country as well. And I think, but going back to co-design, it's the relationship, it's the partnership. And I think one of the key challenges is, the value in Aboriginal people, but also the value in the diversity of Aboriginal people, the lived experiences, not only within our many nations. Don't get too caught up into the homogenous grouping of Aboriginal people, because, we've heard here, I'm Gomeroi, we're sort of similarities, we're both river mob, but, we've got mountains. We're different soil colour and all of that. We come with different cultural lenses, and that's the beauty with our saltwater brothers and sisters. And that diversity. And I think we embrace the value of diversity, but do we really understand the value of diversity, and particularly with Aboriginal people? That is the benefit, and that goes against the deficit economy that's driven our whole policy agenda. And how do we actually encapsulate it and bring that into Treasury process, policy processes and that? And the answer is the relationship, just not designing space. And it goes back to what I was saying, the courage of creating the rights environment, because co-design isn't about bringing people to the table and having a voice. And I always think back to Victor Stephenson, who has been the leader of bringing out cultural burns across this country. And he was on Q&A and basically he was asked the question, how do we embrace Indigenous cultural knowledge and cultural burns? And very easily answered, let us be in the driver's seat. Be comfortable with that, because unfortunately most of the time we're not even invited to be in the car. So I think that's changed. We are in the car, but and that goes back to the courage of it's okay. And I think touching on COVID, one of the great things that I've seen the benefits of coming out of COVID is this wide acceptance that it's a huge paradigm shift, particularly in government, that you can work from home. And productivity doesn't get impacted. So that acceptance of there are different ways of doing things, and where we bring it, there are different ways to do things in this context. It's just a very old way that comes and is embedded in the DNA of this country. And that's the gift that we're willing to share. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. And look, talking about COVID, obviously in the wake of COVID, we've grown more used to flexible working arrangements and working from home. And really, what are some of those challenges and opportunities that have presented themselves? I'll hand over to you first, Kathrina, as the Public Service Commissioner.
Yeah, I think one of the opportunities was just highlighted there that, if I go back a step, we've actually had flexible work as a policy in New South Wales since Mike Baird was Premier, and he announced flexible work policy on an if not, why not basis. But I think it's pretty fair to say that the take-up of that policy was pretty patchy and inconsistent across the sector, and it often depended on who your immediate manager was and their attitude towards flexible work. But what COVID did show us was, we accelerated this trend to flexible work, that it could be successful, we could maintain productivity, and we found that that was the case last year. Productivity was either maintained or increased. As a sector, we actually increased our engagement. So in our People Matter employee survey, engagement across the sector actually went up by 1%, which is actually quite significant across such a large workforce. I think we need to hang on to those sorts of benefits as we're emerging from COVID now. Now, we've got many people working through these hybrid work arrangements. What about new ways of working? So I think it still has a way to play out, but there are some challenges that we're also grappling. So we know that, it is challenging when you've got a dispersed team to, keep people connected to each other. So, we need to try different ways to do that. You do miss things around those social connections that you just get from going into the kitchen to get a cup of tea or crossing paths with somebody in the corridor. And we know that onboarding new staff in this sort of distributed work environment is a bit more challenging. I onboarded into this role when 100% of my organisation were working from home. I have to say it was actually really, really hard to get to know people, and I think it takes extra effort and different ways of doing things. And I also have in mind, what about our junior staff and our grads that come into our workplace? Junior staff often learn a lot from just observing and being with more senior people and getting on the job coaching. So what are we going to do to bring junior staff up and to, you know, coach and teach them and bring them into the team? So those are some of the challenges, but I think that, you know, we're up to it as a sector, and we want to keep the good bits of it, but and, you know, take up those opportunities, but also have a way of addressing some of those challenges as well.
Bill?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's, Kathrina probably touched on most of it really in terms of both opportunities and challenges. I think the challenge now is that working out what that balance is, as people either come back and some stay at home, and how that actually works. But the connection is probably the biggest challenge in terms of how we keep people connected with each other, and certainly mental health, you know, in that time, and particularly from COVID, has become one of those elements that we need to really keep focused on with our teams and our staff, and really understanding how we do that more so as it was one of those challenges ultimately. I think the opportunity to be at home and see your kids more often, certainly, and, you know, you jump online now and there's, you know, a kid will pop up, and I think that's really great. Or the cat shows its backside usually more than anything, but, you know, or the dog's in the background. I think people have seen a human side of people for them being at home as well, and that's helped even a little bit more with the connection and given some other things to happen. And look, technology in itself going astray at times, we've just had to be really adaptable in terms of what we do and how we do connect, and we've found solutions, you know, on the whole, to be able to do things. And I think that's just the nature of who we are. And yeah, I've probably had more meetings than I've ever had in terms of being off, and that was sort of one of the challenges. The work-life balance was a little bit harder in some form, just even working from home, because it was just, well, there's a spot there and they don't have to travel, let's put a meeting in there somewhere. But it also meant that I connected with a lot more people right across public service, and particularly because of COVID and how we had to really connect with a lot of people to make sure our communities were safe. But I think there's some of the opportunities that came out of it.
Fantastic. Joann?
So I'll very much sort of variations on a theme in terms of the challenges and opportunities that Treasury is now calling out hybrid working arrangements. So a couple of examples, and because one of the things that you'd asked us to sort of think about, Stephen, was what about the challenges or opportunities for our Aboriginal employees? So I took advantage last year of going and visiting my mum in Lismore and taking the kids during school holidays and spending a couple of weeks there. 1 week I was on leave and the other week I was working. So for a Deputy Secretary, that was pretty awesome to have been able to have left Sydney for a week and still be able to be engaged with work and to keep everything moving sort of in my group. That was amazing. But to be doing it from home, and I know a lot of my employees took advantage of that sort of thing as well. And I know from a couple of the Aboriginal employees that I regularly talk to, that meant that they were able to have more connection back to their country and to home and family and kith and kin than they would have had in an ordinary year. So it actually did help in a lot of ways, kind of with that connection and being able to ground yourself at a time that was really stressful in terms of for the whole community. The other thing it was in terms of connecting with employees across the whole public sector. I chair the policy compacts, so that many of you might be aware of the various communities of practice. And we were a reasonably new compact, and we'd sort of only just started running seminars in person and that sort of thing. And then COVID hit, and we had this set of grand plans for a conference we were going to hold and all this sort of stuff. And we kind of then had a meeting, and we were like, well, what are we going to do now? We just decided to switch it to webinars. Our membership quadrupled, and our reach in terms of seminars went from about 50 to 60 people turning up at a seminar to us regularly getting a couple of hundred people on webinars, because policy is done across the entire public service. And there were a whole heap of people in regional New South Wales who were based in regional New South Wales who had not been able to come to Sydney for the benefit of one 45-minute seminar, who were suddenly able to access the seminars that were being provided by that compact. So, and including yesterday, yesterday, the Premier actually spoke to that compact. So all of this stuff goes up on our website if you're interested. So in some ways, again, it was that, as Kathrina and Lil mentioned, there had been flexible work had been available, but there were still barriers in place, and COVID just meant, there were a whole heap of those barriers that instantly fell because we told people they had to go work from home, and we had to find workarounds for how we dealt with things to be able to, particularly, across all of the New South Wales service sectors, every single cluster faced incredible challenges with how to deal with COVID. And so for none of us was it, I hear these stories about, people who took up new hobbies and all of this sort of thing during COVID. And I'm like, where did they find the time? Because anybody I talk to in the public service, it's like, that was one of the busiest years of my career. We had to find ways of working around it. We had to find new ways of doing things. If you were in an office sort of based job like mine, you could do it from home. But if you're a frontline service worker, you have to find a safe way to get to work, a way to keep your family safe if COVID invades your workplace and that sort of thing. Really an incredibly innovative time for us as a public service for how we manage the well-being of our employees, we're able to continue to deliver on our responsibilities of public servants, and how we were therefore able to continue to deliver to our customers, the people of New South Wales. So.
Hey, Peter, do you have anything else to add?
I guess just quickly, I've already, it just feeds on what I was saying, different ways to do things. And I think for me, the great opportunity there is, it was change by necessity. So, we were able to push through that barrier of change mainly means risk in a lot of contexts. And coming from a strategy position, and that was great because, as we've heard, this change drove innovation, and was complemented by innovation. So, that's the challenge of where we keep on going, which, for a lot of us, I think, in the engagement level, gave a new way of doing business and a new way, particularly of mob engaging with out in the regions. And I think that's been one of the biggest benefits that I've seen. In terms of some of the challenges, from an Aboriginal perspective, I missed, being able to muck around and have yarns with mob in the office and that. We still did it online, but it sort of didn't really lose those connections. But I think, just from a personal front, I have elderly parents. They're going through, my mum's going through major health issues, so I was able to go up and work from country a lot. So that flexibility. So, and that broadened out. And of course, when I was there, I was able to sort of tie into my cultural obligations to my community a lot more, where down here it's like that's what we also struggle with, our obligations to our communities and that, and getting the balance of time and that. So I think that was a challenge. It still is a challenge, but it also opens up a lot of opportunities for, and with anything new, we've just got to work out the best ways to do things.
And, it brought about the phrase, "You're on mute."
Yeah.
Or you say something that you shouldn't because you're not on mute. Look, I'm just conscious of time. Do we have any questions in the audience at all?
An easy question. No. I think it leverages off the point Pete made before, is to create the space for people to come together. Because if we don't create that time, it doesn't allow people to build those relationships. So whether it's a set time in a day or a week, or something that's about people coming together at a certain place, that could be it, or it could well be online. But creating the space for people to have the conversations and giving permission for that to happen. And it might not be, might not be able to do it at that particular time, but it's working with managers to go, look, I'd really like to go and do this. And so I think it's that creating of the space to allow people to build those positive relationships and trusting relationships.
Right, Kathrina?
I think for me it's understanding that in any organisation everybody owns culture. So obviously leaders play a really big role in shaping culture, but every individual owns culture. We all have a sphere of influence no matter what level we sit in the organisation, and for people just to reflect on what are they doing to contribute to shaping the sort of workplace culture that we should have. Thanks.
So I'll give two quick answers. One from an individual level, giving acknowledgements of country and practicing giving acknowledgements of country. Another thing quick for individuals is instead of asking in the kitchen, so did you watch the football on the weekend, which isn't particularly inclusive, why don't you ask a more open-ended question and say, what did you do on the weekend, which gives people more space to be able to answer it in the way they want to answer it. And because I keep coming back to this as an organisational leader, I was quite shocked when I came to New South Wales Treasury a couple of years ago that they did not have a reconciliation action plan. So I guess the other thing, both from an organisational point of view, is does your agency have a reconciliation action plan? If it does not, then you might want to start working on one as an organisation. If it does, then is there a reconciliation action plan working group that sits alongside that, or what are the other processes that sit alongside your RAP, and how can you get involved?
Look, I think what's been said, personal ownership of reconciliation. And I go back to one of my early life lessons from my father of saying you value something more that you work for than what is given to you in a lot of cases. So you have to own it, but work on it. It's not going to be easy. It's not going. And part of that is I always speak to people. A good way is having a personal charter of what you're going to do in this space. I think, and the good starting point is that acknowledging country. We've heard what does it really mean to acknowledge country? I always say on the other side, acknowledgement to country is the reciprocation of the gift that is given to you when you get welcome to country. And it's reinforcing your obligations of what it means to those people of this country, but also in general the society that you're actually working within, what you're wanting, what your aspirations are for your family in that context, but the people from this country, understanding their aspirations, both the impacts of their past, but also for their future. What do they see? The needs for their kids and their grandkids, and what role we have to address some of those issues that have gone before us.
Right. Thank you, and I think that brings us to a close. So I want to thank all our panellists for being here today and really sharing with all of us their wealth of expertise, especially when we were talking about the importance of truth-telling, our local history and understanding that, what reconciliation means, and what we can all do to take action and to help build those bridges when we work with mob. Again, thank you everyone for coming today. Please join us for morning tea, and look forward to catching up. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everyone. And cut. No.
So